Chapter 8, Barrows. According to Wikipedia, it is a tumulus, plural tumuli. The word tumulus is Latin for mound or small hill, from the PIE root tu with extended zero-grade tum, to bulge, swell, also found in tumor, thumb, thigh and thousand, a mound of earth and stones raised over a grave or graves. Tumuli are also known as barrows, burial mounds, hugelgrab or kurgans, and can be found throughout much of the world. A tumulus composed largely or entirely of stones is usually referred to as a cairn. A long barrow is a long tumulus, usually for numbers of burials. The method of inhumation may involve a dolmen, a cist, a mortuary enclosure, a mortuary house, or a chamber tomb. It's a grave, although the Latin word does not mean the grave, but a small hill. That's a big difference. They also can be long or round, stone or earth, etc. When we look at the traditional archaeological definition of tumuli, we are offered bank barrow, bell barrow, bowl barrow, D-shaped barrow, round barrow with a purposely flat edge at one side, often defined by stone slabs. Fancy barrow, a generic term for any Bronze Age barrows more elaborate than a simple hemispherical shape. Long barrow. Oval barrow, a Neolithic long barrow consisting of an elliptical, rather than rectangular or trapezoidal, mound. Platform barrow, the least common of the recognized types of round barrow, consisting of a flat, wide circular mound, which may be surrounded by a ditch. They occur widely across southern England with a marked concentration in East and West Sussex. Pond barrow, a barrow consisting of a shallow circular depression, surrounded by a bank running around the rim of the depression. Ring barrow, a bank which encircles several burials. Round barrow, a circular feature created by the Bronze Age peoples of Britain and also the later Romans, Vikings, and Saxons. Divided into subclasses such as saucer and bell barrow. Saucer barrow, circular Bronze Age barrow featuring a low, wide mound surrounded by a ditch, which may be accompanied by an external bank. Square barrow, burial site, usually of Iron Age date, consisting of a small, square, ditched enclosure surrounding a central burial, which may also have been covered by a mound. If the archaeologists are right, and barrows are just grave plots, they could be any shape. But do we believe each had a different function or the same purpose in various forms? The truth is that there are, in my view, just 5 categories of barrow. Long barrow, the most significant and earliest form used for burials. Round barrows, big and round, used as markers. Pond barrows, wells for water extraction. Disturbed barrows, round, long and pond barrows that have degraded over 5,000 years by the elements and man's attempts to destroy or excavate them. Copy barrows, imitation barrows from a later date, mimicking their ancestors. Barrow altitude. We have surveyed a sample of 50 prehistoric sites and monuments within the Stonehenge area to look at their topology in connection to the landscape. Our findings show that the traditional belief that prehistoric man located his burials, ceremonial sites and structures on top of hills are wholly inaccurate. In fact, our survey shows that only 8% of sites are on top of a hill. This includes our most ancient site, Stonehenge. Consequently, we are led to believe by archaeologists that our ancestors brought the blue stones all the way from Wales, some 250 miles, only to stop 50 meters short of the top of the hill because they were tired, or for some other obscure unknown ceremonial or astronomical reason. Moreover, our survey also shows that these barrows were not constructed at random heights either. In the Stonehenge sample, the lowest burial was at 89 meters above sea level, the highest at 115 meters. The only logical reason you would construct your barrow at the midpoint or 2/3 up a hillside would be that there was another overriding factor to consider. This reason can only be that you can't build a barrow below this level, as it would be underwater. The variations shown in these sites is due to the groundwater tables falling from the Mesolithic, high, to the Neolithic, low, after which barrows were no longer built for their original purpose, as the Bronze, Iron Age, Vikings and even Saxon civilizations copied their ancestral rituals and barrows for burial purposes only, and these are the only barrows built are below the old prehistoric water table. This empirical evidence I call archaeology of the landscape, where we can date the ancient sites by the location of their shorelines. Long barrows. The first thing we should note about long barrows is that they are unique to Northern Europe, unlike round barrows, which are found all over the world. Archaeologists agree that the long barrow is the oldest monument to exist in our landscape. As shown by the carbon dating from Carnac in France of St. Michael's tumuli, a long barrow, dated to 6850 BCE. Prior to this confirmation, archaeologists have always believed these enormous and elaborate structures, which include giant megaliths at their entrances, clearly belonged to a civilization that lived long ago. Moreover, they are also aware that the bones from many dead people were collected together inside the chambers, rather than in individual graves, or cremations that were seen at a later date. The number and condition of these bones show us that they were disarticulated, with only the larger bones and skulls being brought to the sites after death, probably after the bones had been defleshed. We believe their shape and design are of great importance. Firstly, the monuments are long and thin, with the entrance at the end of the mound. The entire long barrow mound originally had a ditch dug completely around its exterior, to represent water and the voyage to the afterlife. During the prehistoric period, long barrows like West Kennet were on a peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water. This groundwater now gives us a clue as to why the ditches that surrounded the monument were dug, for the bottom of the ditches would have been below the groundwater table at this location. Therefore, the ditches of today were moats of yesteryear. The other noteworthy aspect of long barrows is the size and construction of the monument. At West Kennet and other long barrows, giant megaliths were used to highlight the entrance to the chambers. These boulders are over 15 tons in weight and 4 to 5 meters in height. They are an unnecessary addition to the construction, but they are visible even a couple of miles away on a clear day. Long barrows, when first constructed, would have been covered not with grass as today, but with the subsoil that came from the ditches they dug that surrounded the monument. In the case of West Kennet, it would be bright white chalk. The massive size of these monuments must also be taken into consideration, as they are over 100 meters in length, 5 times longer than the chambers they hide within them, and they are tapered from the helm 4 meters high to the bow, just 1 meter high, making them look like a gigantic direction indicator. Another remarkable aspect of long barrows is their location and position on the landscape. If we look at the extensive riverways after the last ice age, we notice that these monuments are built parallel to major rivers and appear at junctions where rivers converge. Moreover, they don't appear on the top of the hills that surround the rivers, but actually appear just over halfway up, so that they cannot be seen over the top of the hill on the opposite side. Because of their size and construction materials, these markers are visible for miles like white pointers in daylight, but because they are pure white, they can also be seen at night with moonshine. The long barrow represents the boat culture of this ancient society. They lived in boats, and so, when they died, they were sent on their last voyage by boat to the afterlife. Even today, we still have a custom of placing money over a dead person's eyes as their fare to be collected by the ferryman. Consequently, this also gives us a fantastic insight into the design of the boats used in this period. This boat looks more like a barge than a canoe, with the back end, the stern, being where they steered the craft with a rudder, which means they used sails, not paddles, for power. Round barrows. In our examination of long barrows, we have discovered that this civilization traded heavily with other cultures, tribes, clans and groups within prehistoric Britain and beyond. Herefordshire businessman Alfred Watkins was sitting in his car one summer afternoon, during a visit to Blackwoodine in Herefordshire in 1921, when he happened to consult a local map and noticed that a number of prehistoric and other ancient sites in the area fell into alignments. Subsequent field and map work convinced him that this pattern was indeed a real one. Watkins came to the conclusion that he saw the vestigial traces of old straight tracks laid down in the Neolithic period, probably, he surmised, for traders' routes. He concluded that after modernization in the later Bronze and Iron Age periods, the tracks had fallen into disuse during the early historic period. The pattern had been accidentally preserved here and there due to the Christianization of individual pagan sites that were markers along the old straight tracks. He published these theories in 2 books. Reaction to Watkins' book The Old Straight Track was sharply divided. Many thought he had uncovered a long-forgotten secret within the landscape, and the Straight Track Club was formed to carry out further lay hunting, while orthodox archaeologists vehemently dismissed the whole notion. And with a few notable exceptions, this situation still exists today. There are 2 kinds of tracks. Firstly, as we have shown, the older long barrows were markers based on islands and peninsulas within the river routes to known sites. Then, after the groundwater subsided, round barrows were used for overland routes. When the groundwater subsided after the Neolithic period, our ancestors needed a further navigational aid to allow them to find the location overland rather than by river as in the past. These markers are known today as round barrows, and they are consequently more frequent than long barrows because dense foliage makes the line of sight shorter for someone on foot than for someone taking the same route by boat, and secondly there are more routes by foot than by river to navigate. The incorrectly conceived aspect of Watkins' land markers is that they did not run in perfectly straight lines, but actually to the high ground. This was because the lower ground that had been flooded in the Mesolithic period would still be boggy and wet in some seasons, and therefore impassable. Therefore, these tracks are straight, but not ruler straight as Watkins first believed. One of the closest sites to Stonehenge is Quarley Hill, to the east. The path between these 2 sites passes 13 barrows, in a 15 kilometers distance. If you stand on top of one of these barrows, you can see the next one in line very clearly. You must also take into consideration that farmers have ploughed out nearly half the barrows, and that the mounds would have been at least 30% larger, and pure white, at time of construction. Even so, they can still be seen as path markers today in some areas, 5,000 years later. It is almost impossible to know what information would have greeted a walker in the Neolithic when he reached a round barrow, but we still have Roman milestones surviving today on our modern roads, and I believe this is a relic from our ancient past. One can only imagine that somehow the barrow, like a milestone, would give an indication of the distance to be travelled. This was probably on a standing stone, buried upright in the centre of the barrow. It should also be noted that the burials within these round barrows were placed in them at a much later date, which would explain why these barrows do not contain burials at the centre, and have been dug into the edges as an afterthought and not the original design. Pond barrows. Now we have established the use of the majority of prehistoric barrows by our ancestors. We can look at the other barrows catalogued by archaeologists, to see what function they had in helping our ancestors navigate from town to town in prehistoric days. Pond barrows' shape is just as described, pond-like, and as we now understand, the groundwater tables were higher in the past, consequently, creating artificial ponds. Water, in any civilization, is critical to survival. Our ancestors were no exception, so when they traveled on foot to other towns or sites, the provision of water was essential. Most pond barrows have the center dugout, which would have tapped into the groundwater course. This would allow the pond to flood, depending on the tide levels. This tradition continues into modern days by the use of dew ponds, which are of the same size and shape, but relied more on rainwater to fill the pond. Disturbed and copied barrows. These barrows are the original path markers that have either eroded over the last 5,000 years or the remains have been altered and adapted over time by later descendants. Burials within round barrows mark a change in use by later civilizations, including the mimicking of similar round barrows by Bronze and Iron Age people, including the Vikings, as a mark of respect for their ancestors who they wish to be buried amongst, and hence the historical confusion and variety. Case study: Winterbourne Crossroads. The Winterbourne Stoke Crossroads Round Barrow Cemetery comprises a linear arrangement of 19 late Neolithic, early Bronze Age circular earthwork monuments, commonly known as round barrows. Winterbourne Stoke 3 to 10 are aligned to the northeast of the Neolithic long barrow known as Winterbourne Stoke 1. They extend southwest and northeast for nearly 600 meters. This alignment continues after a gap of 100 meters. A roughly parallel secondary alignment immediately to the west comprises Winterbourne Stoke 2A to 12. A cluster of barrows sits slightly apart, 250 meters northwest of the main alignment. Most of the barrows were excavated by Sir Richard Colthaw in the early 19th century. What is missing from the above explanation by English Heritage is the earthworks throughout the site, which are both unmeasured and unexcavated. This is because the most fundamental understanding of the environment at the time of these barrows' construction is unknown or misunderstood. If they looked under the surface of the soil, they would see that not too far away from this large number of barrows are the remains of a large Paleochannel river. If you look at a map of this area, you will see the modern crossroads that now lies in the middle of the barrow complex. This intersection is no accident of history. As we have discussed previously, round barrows are markers for Neolithic pathways, and therefore, when these prehistoric roads cross, you will get a collection of barrows from separate directions. Modern roads are mainly built on the remains of previous roads, which in turn are constructed again on their initial ancient pathways. The closest earthworks to the Winterbourne Crossroads run northwest to southeast for about 500 meters. It then seems to meet another earthwork running north-northwest to south-southeast for about the same distance, making the entire earthwork about 1 kilometer long. We are therefore looking at a 20,000 cubic meter excavation taking about 20,000 hours using Stone Age tools, or 100 men taking about 20 days, or 1 man taking 5 years, non-stop, so not a small farming feature archaeologists may have you believe. Sitting at the height of 110 meters above sea level, it is a curious feature. It can't be defensive, as you can walk around the edge. It can't be for animals, as it stops nothing. Fences would be much effective and take less than 5 years to build. With the Mesolithic groundwater level, 85 meters to 95 meters, the long barrow, Woolsford 34, is surrounded, like Stonehenge, on 3 sides, making it a peninsula. But as the Mesolithic waters receded, the long barrow became isolated, so a dike, canal, was built to meet the new shoreline. This new dike would eventually service not just 1 but 3 long barrows, Stoke 1, Woolsford 34, and Woolsford 41. Even more surprising is a second dike that was in a completely different direction, southwest, cuts into the Neolithic waterway, which is 10 meters lower at this point, creating a dike to the lake group of round barrows connecting with the Long Barrow Dike. Although these existing earthworks have not been investigated and sadly mostly destroyed through ploughing, they still are scheduled monuments and appear as part earthworks in 2 parts on most OS maps. Fortunately, the size and extent of this feature can still be seen on satellite photographs. The northwest dike has been cut to lead to not just 1, but all 3 long barrows in this area, which is beyond a coincidence. As we have already discussed, the Long Barrow is where our prehistoric ancestors buried their dead's bones from the excavation site. If Stonehenge was the last place of rest, then these are 3 of the 4 long barrows on the River Avon that are nearest the site. Using archaeology of the landscape techniques, we can now estimate that initially the Mesolithic shoreline reached Woolsford 34 and turned it into a peninsula, which indicates that it is the oldest of the long barrows. Stoke 1 seems to be the second oldest in the late Mesolithic or early Neolithic, as the dike appears to have been extended northwest to the crossroads. Finally, during the Neolithic, the last long barrow, Woolsford 41, was built, and the dike was again extended southeast this time, and a second dike running northeast, from the Neolithic river level, was finally built to meet the first dike, which may have started to lose water height and volume. This just one example of how the prehistoric raised groundwater levels not only giving us the reason for these strange landscape features, but also dates and sequences for these long barrows at Winterbourne. Case study: the Cursus. If you draw a line from Stonehenge altar to the Preseli mountain region in South Wales, you will find that your line not only points to the horizon where the midsummer moon sets, but leads over the far western edge of the Cursus, past a point believed to contain yet another crescent bluestone circle facing northwest, which was first suspected by Atkinson but has yet to be located. Now, if you do the same exercise with the direction of the summer solstice sunrise, drawing a line from the center of Stonehenge through the heel stone, you will see on the horizon another long barrow which, though it has now been ploughed out, marks the other end of the Cursus. So, we have an alignment from the center of Stonehenge to the Preseli Mountains that cuts over the western end of the Cursus, and an alignment over the eastern end of the Cursus to Woodhenge. If you examine the profile of this area, the Cursus cuts across a valley that we have now proved was full of groundwater in the Mesolithic period. This would have given the monument the appearance of two islands separated by groundwater, and clearly, this is what our ancestors saw. This being the case, it does not take much imagination to see that when the groundwater receded during the Neolithic period, to maintain the water connection between the two end sites of the Cursus, they dug a ditch that encapsulated the entire region. What we see in the Cursus is a giant model of the world as our ancestors perceived it. On the eastern side was a long barrow representing death, where the bones were stored. In between lay the water and the final journey to the afterlife. On the western bank of the Cursus was an island, probably marked with a large standing stone, where the ancestors arrived after death, no doubt to be reborn again. Let us recap what we have learnt this chapter. 28. The positioning of long barrows high on hillsides overlooking and in full view of ancient waterways proves that they were used to navigate the higher and larger rivers of Mesolithic Britain and northern Europe. 29. The dikes of Winterbourne crossroads not only prove the existence of water at Stonehenge in both the Mesolithic and Neolithic period, it also shows us how this civilization used these waterways for their burial practices. 30. The Cursus makes no sense in the landscape until we place the waters of the Mesolithic when it becomes a boat crossing between death and the afterlife. This proof is verified when they attempted to continue this water connection in the Neolithic by adding a ditch to create a moat around the site.